Nice boy. My musket's gonna fossilize it. What's up, YouTube? It's RainingCardGames, and welcome back to another episode of Rogue Rundown. It's been quite a while since we did the last one. If you haven't seen that one, check out the two videos for the Alien mini-series for Rogue Rundown. Had a lot of fun making those intro skits. But anyway, let's talk about the deck for today's episode. And this will be a condensed episode, not 1 and 2 parts. It'll just be all in one single video. And that is when you mix magical musketeers and you mix fossils. Fossil magical muskets. So, let's go ahead and talk about the theory behind the deck. But before we go ahead and just jump into the deck theory, if you would be so kind as to hit that like button, comment down below, and check out the links down in the description. All these things really do help out the channel, and I do appreciate your guys' support very much. Now, how does this deck work? Well, you see, fossil cards that came out in Battles of Legend Armageddon, I was so excited for them. I'm a huge fan of Jim Croc from GX, and I like the playstyle, how the cards work and everything. There's only one problem. They can't really be built as a pure fossil archetype because, well, one, the card pool is very small. You're only talking about one main deck monster in Weathering Soldier, and then everything else is spell cards. I mean, obviously you have Fossil Dino, but that doesn't really go with the rest of the fossil cards. It doesn't really have the synergy besides being a rock type monster. Because you want to special summon, but you can't really whilst Fossil Dino is on the field, and you kind of have to, negate its effects temporarily in order to get off your plays, and that doesn't really benefit you in the long run, because it's just too many hoops to jump for something that can be consistent. So when the fossil cards came out, I tried to build it pure, and it just doesn't work because the deck cannot go first to save its life. Obviously it can, but really, as a pure variant, it doesn't really work. So, that's why we combine the deck with Magical Musketeers. Why? Because the Magical Musketeers are an archetype that very well functions going second. However, they can play on the first turn. That is the key point here, because honestly, if you're just playing pure fossil, what are you going to do? You don't have cards in your opponent's graveyard, most likely, unless they have a hand trap. But other than that, then you're probably just summoning a Skullbone pass. It doesn't really have much. Obviously, Fossil Fusion will potentially give it a little bit of protection, but it's not that much in the long run. So that's why you're mixing stuff in with the Magical Musketeers, because the Magical Musketeers can set up at least something, so you can normal summon one of their monsters like a Caspar, and then interact with your opponent using their spells and traps, and then on the next turn, then you can abuse the fossil cards to actually go in for OTK damage, because Magical Musketeers, while you can OTK with that deck, usually it's because of an outside method like Utopia Double or something along those lines. But on their own, the Magical Musketeer cards are usually just poking and controlling the game, picking apart boards. So, with the fossil cards, we can essentially use this as the killing strike. You summon a Magical Musketeer, you use your spells and traps to essentially pick apart their board, break them apart, gain more advantage, swarm the field, and then you can use your fossil cards to kill your opponent off. And what's great is, all you have to do is all Magical Musketeers, they have their effects trigger when cards are activated in their column. So just make sure you're activating your fossil cards in the column of the Magical Musketeer monster. Also, you must keep in mind that you can only activate Magical Musketeer spells and traps during your opponent's turn and your turn from your hand. So it's not like you can activate a Fossil Fusion from your hand on your opponent's turn. It has to be a Magical Musketeer card. So really your Magical Musketeer monsters are just there to interact, and then your fossil cards are solely for your turn. So in terms of the deck building itself, obviously you're going to see in the deck profile how it's structured. Essentially, you do have a very heavy, decently sized Magical Musketeer lineup. The fossil engine is rather small, so it gives you a space to play around with your ratios of the Magical Musketeer monsters. However, you also can keep in mind that because you're going second strategy, you can always cater in things. So how you'll see in the deck profile, I am running a Kaiju engine, but you can maybe consider hand traps. It's really up to player preference, and same goes for the extra deck. Really, it's the fossil cards that you're going to have all access to in the extra deck, and then the in terms of the magical muskets, really it's only their Link Monster Max. It's the only one that really matters in terms of the magical musketeers. Everything else can be extra. It just more so what's catered to your local environment, what's catered to your local gaming environment online, because right now we can't really go to locals and duel in person. But all in all, that is the basic theory behind the deck. Use magical muskets to go first if you have to and set up some interaction, or go second, pick apart your opponent's board, and then once everything's clear, make the fossil monsters hit the field. But let's go ahead and take a look at the deck profile. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the deck profile. So starting off, for our main deck fossil monsters, 3 Weathering Soldier. In fact, this is the only main deck fossil monster that you're running. Fossil Dyna isn't really part of the archetype, even though it has the word fossil in its name. But Weathering Soldier, this is the card that obviously we want to see in the graveyard. We're dumping it either through Miracle Rupture or destroying it by battle. But in worst comes to worst, it is a 2K beat stick. But all in all, this is what gives us access to our fossil plays. Now, moving on to the Magical Musketeer lineup, we have our 3 Caspar, arguably one of the best cards in the deck. Whenever anything is activated in his column, as you all know, you get to search a Magical Musketeer card. And then you get to activate magic. All of the Magical Musketeer monsters allow you to activate their spells and traps from the hand during either player's turn. So it's really great, and being able to use their cards as to gain you advantage. It's solid going first, but really it's amazing going second. Moving on, we have our 3 Starfire. This is our next big playmaker, and this is how we gain board presence and get extra advantage when playing our spells and traps, or our opponent plays spells and traps in her column. And she also enables us to go into potential rank 4 plays. Now moving on, we are running 2 Kid Brave. This is kind of a little mini mulligan in the hand. Activate a card, pitch a if a card's activated in his column, pitch a Magical Musketeer card from your hand to the graveyard. Then you get to draw 2 cards. So it gets us a little bit of advantage, but obviously he's not as good as the first 2. And then the rest of the Magical Musketeer monsters that we're running are one-ofs. Calamity, which is primarily our Starfire target when we're bringing her out from the deck. Doc, he helps just recycle cards from our graveyard back to our hand. And Magical Musketeer Wild cycles cards from the graveyard back in the hand and gets us 1. But all in all, these are more 2 targets that we're bringing out from Starfire. He's just for the long game and recyclability. Now, we are running a Kaiju engine in our deck because we do want to go second. So we're running 2 Gameciel and 2 Dogoron. Now, these cards are basically, you could swap these out and consider hand traps, but I'm running these 4 Kaijus along with Interrupted Kaiju Slumber. You can obviously swap these out for a more hand trap heavy lineup, but in terms of interaction, a lot of decks can play through hand traps, so rather, why not just tribute over their Appaloosa, their Borreload Savage, or any other problematic monsters that they may have on their field. And that will do it for the monster lineup. On to the spells. The only Magical Musketeer spell that we're running is the best one, Cross Domination. This is essentially a quick play infinite impermanence, and because of our Magical Musketeer effects, we can activate this from our hand whenever we want. So it's really great, and then also on top of negating a monster's effects, it makes them all their attack 0. So this is also great for dealing in heavy damage, and yeah, all in all, this is just a great card and a must-have at 3. On to the fossil cards, we are running Triple Fossil Fusion. This is the main playmaker to get us into our big Fossil Fusion monsters by banishing monsters from our graveyard and also our opponent's graveyard. You can do just your graveyard, but really you want to do it with your opponent's graveyard as well, so you can get that protection effect from the Fossil Fusion, and then also it can recycle itself when a Fossil Fusion is destroyed. And then we have our Miracle Rupture, which is our Foolish Burial for the deck. And then also, if we happen to have Fossil Fusion in hand, we also get to draw a card. So it gives us a little extra advantage and incentive, but this is essentially how we are sending Weathering Soldier to the graveyard. Moving on, we are only running 2 Time Stream. It's not completely necessary to run this. Obviously, if you want to go more heavy on spells and traps, you can, but I like to have it. It enables us to climb into some of our higher fusion monsters, just in case, let's say, our opponent doesn't have a level 6 or 7 or 8 monster in their graveyard. This can help us still get out some of the bigger fusion monsters and surpass those summoning requirements. And then lastly, for the spell and traps, we are also running 2 Interrupted Kaiju Slumber. This is essentially a way to clear boards or also bait out negations, either spell and trap negate or an Ash Blossom. This is a great way to get rid of some of the negations on board, so that way you can clear the way for your magical muskets and fossils to hit the field. And then also later in the game you can banish it to search a kaiju, so that way it's great in the long game in terms of dealing with your opponent's board. Moving on to the trap lineup. 3 Desperado. This is a target and pop a face-up card on our opponent's side of the field, so it's really great. You can essentially just chain this to anything else. So let's say you chain it your Imperm, which is your cross domination, then you can chain this. So it's really great that you can just interact and just pop your opponent's cards on your turn or on their turn. Now we are running 2 of the counter trap, Last Stand, which is a spell and trap negate. So if this were an Omni negate, obviously it would be at 3, but because it's spell and trap, it's sometimes dependent. Obviously, not all decks are really heavy reliant on spell and trap combos. Obviously, there are more monster combos, which is why Cross Domination is probably the best card, because it deals with that in that regard. But this still does come up and can be very handy against back row decks as well. And considering you can activate this from the hand, you don't have to worry about columns with infinite impermanence or anything. Now, we are running 2 Dancing Needle. This is essentially a triple DD Crow for either graveyard. This is a great card to really help manage your opponent's graveyard along with the Fossil Fusion, so essentially you're depriving them of resources in their graveyard. And then to round out the traps, we're running the 1 Fiendish Steel, which just protects our magical musketeer monsters, and then the 1 Crooked Crown, which just helps us get out more magical muskets so that we can abuse their effects. And that is going to do it for the main deck. On to the extra deck, we're going to look at first our fossil lineup. So we're running 2 of our Skullbone. This is our easiest monster that we can go into for Fossil Fusion, because we can use just our graveyard. It doesn't have to be our opponent's graveyard. And he can just essentially attack twice if he destroys a monster by battle and attack another monster. But also we can banish him from our graveyard to search our Fossil Fusion. Next up is our other level 4 fusion, which is our Skullgar. Metal Greymon. No, but he does require that you fuse using your opponent's graveyard. So essentially it's Weathering Soldier or a rock monster in our graveyard and a level 4 or lower monster in our opponent's graveyard. And all he does really is he just does piercing battle damage, but we can also banish him from our graveyard to search a time stream. And then to round out the 2 ofs in our extra deck for the fossil lineup, we're running 2 Fossil Warrior Skull Knight. So this guy is essentially similar to Skullgar. He does piercing battle damage and he can attack twice if he destroys a monster by battle, but really also you can banish him from your graveyard and you can pop a card. It's a targeting pop on your opponent's field, so it's really good when you're climbing up into higher fusion levels. And that is going to do it for the 2 ofs in our fossil lineup. And then to round out for the big boys, we are running the 1 Fossil Warrior Skull King and then the 1 Fossil Dragon Skullgios. Both of these come up for different situations. Skullgios is great for OTKing because he can, when he attacks, he can switch the defense and attack of the opponent's monster that it's battling. And then also he does piercing damage and he also does double battle damage. So at 3,500 attack, he can get in high numbers if the opponent's monster's attack is 0, which is where cross domination comes into play. So this is essentially 7,000 points worth of damage. Skull King is great because he also does piercing, but he can attack twice during the battle phase with no restriction. And then on the opponent's turn, I can pitch a card and target a monster in my opponent's graveyard, summon it to my side of the field, so that way I can also deprive my opponent's graveyard of resources. And then we are only running 1 Xyz because we do have a rank 4 ability. This is just to help slow down the play. Let's say I can get out 2 level 4s, but I can't do too much in terms of spell and traps in my hand. I don't have a cross domination or a Desperado in hand, but I can at least get out 2 level 4s. I can just smack a Baguska on the field in defense mode, stall for a turn, essentially slowing down my opponent, then next turn go in with my fossil cards and do a lot of damage. So he's in here, but obviously at this point it's really up to player preference what you guys include in the extra deck. And in terms of the Link monsters, the only ones that really matter in terms of the Magical Musketeer lineup are our 2 Max. This is obviously a great card when your opponent has a full board of monsters or full board of spell and traps. You can gain advantage either by storming the field or getting more Magical Musketeer spells and traps. Great card for gaining advantage. And then the rest of the Link lineup is really up to player preference. So what I'm running is the 1 Cross Sheet because we are fusion summoning and we can use its effect to, you know, gain more advantage and then climb into other stuff or go into other link monsters to tear apart our opponent's board. We're running the one Nightmare Phoenix because obviously this is just a generic pop a spell or trap. It doesn't have to be face up, it can be face down, so that's great. And then also Nightmare Phoenix just to help spin things back into the deck. These are just generic great cards I would consider including, but you can swap things around and play test. You can maybe consider an Access Code Talker, an Appaloosa, or also you can consider stuff like an Unchained Abomination if you're deciding to go crazy with the Desperado. So it's really up to player preference, but I like to run all reliable good old Boral Sword, because obviously you can use Cross Sheep to get more monsters out onto the field, and then Max can also spam out monsters, so you can get enough to really go into Boral Sword and effectively use them, and Boral Sword with any of the fossil monsters on field is essentially an easy OTK. Okay, so I went ahead and shuffled the deck, so let's go ahead and see what a couple of test hands look like. Obviously, this deck doesn't really have combos per se, it's more dependent on what your opponent's playing, but just to give you an idea of what you would do on, essentially, let's say we're going second, because really this deck can go first, but we want to go second. So we'll see what we draw. We draw a Time Stream, interesting. Cross Dom, that's always what we want to see, but really you want to see at least a magical musketeer monster in your hand, and sweet, Starfire. Okay, so here's what we can do. Obviously, Kaiju Slumber is great at neutralizing the board, but also it can bait out Ashes because Starfire's effect can be Ash since she is summoning from the deck. So what we can do first is, let's say our opponent has a full board, hit them with a Kaiju Slumber. That will nuke the field, and let's say they will Ash it, then that's okay, this will die, but then that gives us the ability to summon Starfire, and then from here we can start to, let's say, negate their effect, or what we can do is first we can pop a monster that, let's say we can pop their Boral Sword, they chain Boral Sword's effect, chain Domination, negate that, so all these will go through, their Boral Sword is negated, and then off of Starfire's effect we can summon out a Caspar or something, and then we can link one of these away, and we can go into Max and gain more advantage that way. And that is going to do it for the deck profile and test hands. And yeah, that's pretty much how this deck, I wouldn't say is the highest potential. I mean, it's interesting, this deck, how it works, because in terms of interaction, you're solely relying on your magical muskets to really get the job done, and then your fossil monsters are just there to clean up the mess that they leave and take the match. All in all, I think it's fun. The fossil cards are really fun to play around with, and especially just slamming into your opponent, doing the maximum amount of damage, and then I do like the interaction that Yugioh and Cross Domination have with each other, because it really can hammer in a lot of damage. And I don't know, I just love fossil monsters, so I really wanted to find a deck that they could actually fit in with and actually work, because I really want this deck to work. I want fossils to be playable in 2020, so I think, all in all, I think the pairing with Magical Musketeers did work overall in general. But yeah, that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and stay tuned. Next week we will have our next episode of Sealed Only Dragoonity, so stay tuned for that. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.